Hi there, and welcome to number 2 of Friday's revision recordings for explaining history. Today I'm going to be talking about the long-term causes of the French Revolution. And the French Revolution is an interesting affair because by the mid 18th century, France is perhaps one of the more stable and more powerful nations on the continent, and the possibility of a revolution isn't really talked about, isn't really discussed in French society, and it's not something that appears to have been predicted or even suggested by those contemporary onlookers at the time. Really all comes as something rather of a surprise. But there are long-term indicators that suggest that a revolution might be possible. Now, the first long-term factor in the French Revolution, and this is something that had been developing over the course of a century, from the late 17th through to the late 18th century, is the intellectual movement in Europe called the Enlightenment. Well, firstly, let's ask ourselves what an intellectual movement is. Well, it is a period of time in which ideas about things like science, law, economics, politics, and how a society should be run, and how we understand the world and what things like nature and truth are, these ideas all begin to dramatically change. They begin to dramatically change, really, because of mass literacy, which developed in the 15th and 16th centuries and had grown throughout the 17th and 18th. Mass literacy, mass publishing, so ideas were able to circulate around Europe at a much, much faster pace. And the ability of certain scholars and scientists and intellectuals and philosophers and writers to share ideas and to read each other's ideas in a way that hadn't been possible in previous centuries. So new ideas very quickly established themselves in a way that had previously not been possible, and this causes ideas, particularly among the educated classes in France, to begin to change. The ideas that began to change were those about the legitimacy of the monarchy, the right of the monarch to rule absolutely, i.e., without a parliament, without a constitution, and without any limitation on the king's power. This was a question, something that became increasingly challenged throughout the Enlightenment. The idea that a monarchy was inevitably the best and the most logical government for France was challenged, and the Enlightenment, the thinkers of the Enlightenment, went back and examined the early Greek and Roman republics and questioned, was this not perhaps a better way to do things? The Enlightenment happened over the course of about a century, and it was not contained to France or to Europe even. There were Enlightenment thinkers throughout the 18th century in the Americas. There are even Enlightenment thinkers in the European colonies in Asia that are developing. So it's really gradually becoming a worldwide movement. And what the Enlightenment does is it really shakes up people's way of thinking. It shakes up the idea that a monarchy, and an autocratic monarchy, i.e. one where the king rules absolutely, it shakes up the idea that that is inevitable. And that, over a long period of time, begins to prepare the ground for revolution. In the shorter term, in the decades before the revolution, the problem that really brings France to its knees is debt. France has fought a century of wars against Great Britain throughout the 18th century, to establish herself as the world's premier, the world's number one imperial power. And for the most part, she has lost these wars. Britain has won them. Britain wins in the 7 Years' War, forcing France completely out of the Americas, and France returns the favour during the American War of Independence and forces Britain out of the Americas, with the exception of Canada. The French had to bankroll large parts of the American patriots' fight against Britain. And France also landed an army in the Americas, led by Lafayette, France's Premier General, who would make an important contribution to the revolution. And the cost of this is crippling for France. It's a very expensive undertaking indeed for revenge on Britain. And the problem that France has is that the level of debt goes up and up and up, at the same time that the amount of income that the French government can receive from taxation goes down and down and down. The French government had employed a very inefficient system called tax farming. And tax farming works something like this. A businessman, in essence, will approach the French government and say, I will give you 500,000 livres, which are French notes, French banknotes, now, if you give me the right to collect, say, 1 million livres worth of taxes later on. So it's a loan of cash up front, but what the businessman gets, what the tax farmer gets for that, is the right to collect far more in taxation later on. And every time the French government takes out one of these deals, rather like a kind of payday loan, it winds up worse off, though initially it doesn't appear like that. And it meant that more and more taxes were finding their way into private hands, not into state hands. And France's system of estates, the three estates in French society, the first and the second and the third. The first and the second estate, the clergy and the nobility, the clergy being the first estate and the nobility being the second estate, they're exempt from taxation anyway. So the tax base is the third estate, and the third estate are taxed inefficiently. The third estate have all sorts of other impositions upon them. The poorer members of the third estate are forced to do free labour from time to time in a medieval practice called the corvée, which is Corvee, where essentially peasants are taken off the land for a certain amount of time a year and forced to dig roads and rebuild bridges for the local nobles. This is greatly resented, but it has to be done really because there's not enough money periodically to pay them because of France's debt problems and France's inefficient tax collection problems. So France is approaching a debt crisis. And what happens in a debt crisis normally is that when a country stops being able to pay back their debts, then banks no longer are willing to lend to that country, and that's when the cash flow switches off. France also has a problem with the monarchy itself. The monarchy is ill designed for these kinds of very modern challenges. If you imagine the monarchy, the absolute monarchy of France, is something that perhaps should have died at the end of the Middle Ages and been replaced with something more flexible. But when the modern era emerges, France has very modern challenges, the challenges of building a modern world empire the challenge of paying debts in an increasingly interconnected world, one that requires a government that can kind of think on its feet, a government that can make better decisions, a government where there are different sources of advice and ideas. And this is what a modern government is like. A modern government has lots of government ministers acting independently of the king, coming up with the best solutions they can in the time period that's available, and they don't have the king interfering or saying or trying to manage things. When finally the debt crisis comes in 1788 and 1789, what the response of the king is, and he's urged not to do this, is to call an Estates-General. An Estates-General hadn't been called for nearly a century, and the Estates-General was the meeting of the first representatives of the first, the second, and the third estate. And the first and the second estates are very, very small in terms of people, outnumbered many hundreds of times over by the third estate. But the third estate is only allowed a third of the seats at the Estates-General. The king knows that the first and the second estates will be able to outvote the third estate and impose an economic solution on the third estate. And what the first and the second estates want to do is they want to avoid having to shoulder their part of the big financial bill. So when the Estates-General meets in the summer of 1789, the third estate say, well, this isn't fair. We are not going to ratify anything the king wants. We're not going to agree to anything the king wants. And we're not going to agree to having the burden of taxation dumped on the third estate again, when the first and the second estates pay nothing. And there are even nobles from the second estate and clergy from the first estate who say, well, yeah, this is reasonable. And there are nobles who predicted a revolution, and they said, well, unless we do something sensible now, unless we back and listen to the demands of the third estate, one day they will be unreasonable. One day the third estate will not be so willing to talk things through. They'll impose their will with violence. At the same time, a very different thing is happening. A very different set of events is occurring. France has had, in the previous decade, a series of poor harvests, and France is extremely hungry, particularly the poorest people in France. And it is the people of Paris, the Parisian mob, as they're referred to, the Parisian poor, or the sans-culottes, the people of Paris who really save the third estate in the summer of 1789. The king, anxious to make sure that that an agreement is made, it comes to the decision to bring the troops into Paris and to surround the National Assembly that had formed itself. And the National Assembly, now mainly made up of the Third Estate, refused to budge, refused to go home unless the king agreed to the membership of the Estates-General being based on proportionality, i.e., if the third estate represented 90% of the population, then the delegates should be 90% from the third estate. That was the demand. It looked as if the king was going to suppress, using violence, the National Assembly, which had been given no authority to form itself. And instead, what the king faces is an uprising of the angry, hungry, poor Parisian people, who partly were inspired in defence of the National Assembly, which they saw as their only hope of anything being done about their problems. But in a way, it was really the storming of the Bastille that happens on the 14th of July happens basically because of an outpouring of popular anger and revolutionary tension. And this is based mainly around the fact that Parisians were extremely hungry. So if you were answering a question on this, you might look at the long-term factors, things like the Enlightenment, the fact that people's thinking and ideas were changing at the same time when the monarchy and the government were not. You might look at intermediate factors, such as France's century of warfare and debt. And you might also look at short-term factors, such as the problems of hunger in France in the years before the revolution.